Andrew Johnson was a Tennessee tailor and a complex political figure who became one of the most controversial presidents in American history. Andrew Johnson, 17th President of the United States and the first to be impeached, was born in Raleigh, North Carolina on December 29, 1808. He came from poverty and illiteracy. He had a determined personality and an uncompromising nature. Johnson's early years were marked by hardship and struggle. He never attended school and was apprenticed to a tailor at age 10. His education came from listening to others read and eventually teaching himself, with help from his wife. This lack of formal education would shape his worldview and contribute to his lifelong identification with common people, though his later career would test those loyalties in the most challenging ways imaginable. After completing his apprenticeship, Johnson fled to Tennessee to escape his indenture contract. He settled in Greenville, Tennessee in 1826, where he established a tailor shop. It was in Greenville that Johnson married Eliza McCardle in 1827. She was 16 years old and had received some education. Eliza taught her husband to read and write more proficiently and helped him with arithmetic. The marriage would last until her death and produce 5 children. Johnson's tailor shop became a gathering place for local men to discuss politics and current events. Johnson would work at his trade while engaging in debates and discussions. These conversations fueled his interest in politics and helped him develop his skills as a speaker and debater. Despite his lack of formal education, Johnson proved to be intelligent and quick-witted, able to hold his own in arguments with more educated men. Johnson's political career began at the local level. In 1828, he was elected as an alderman in Greenville. He served in that position for several years before being elected mayor in 1834. These early political experiences taught him the mechanics of government and the importance of connecting with voters. Johnson positioned himself as a champion of the working man, the artisan, and laborer who formed the backbone of Tennessee society. His message resonated with voters who saw in him one of their own. In 1835, Johnson was elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives. He served one term before being elected to the Tennessee Senate in 1841. During his time in the state legislature, Johnson advocated for the rights of small farmers and workers against what he perceived as the aristocratic planter class. He supported public education and internal improvements. His political philosophy was rooted in Jacksonian democracy, emphasizing limited government, states' rights, and opposition to concentrated wealth and power. Johnson's political rise continued in 1843 when he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. He would serve 5 terms in Congress, representing Tennessee's 1st District. In Washington, Johnson remained true to his working-class roots and his strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution. He opposed protective tariffs, which he believed benefited northern manufacturers at the expense of southern farmers. He supported the Mexican-American War and the expansion of slavery into new territories, reflecting the views of his constituents. One of Johnson's signature issues in Congress was his advocacy for a Homestead Act. He believed that public land should be given free to settlers who would work them rather than sold to speculators. This position put him at odds with many Southern Democrats who feared that free land in the West would create more free states and upset the sectional balance of power. Johnson persisted in his advocacy for homesteading, seeing it as a way to help poor white farmers achieve economic independence. His support for this measure demonstrated both his commitment to his principles and his willingness to break with his party when he believed he was right. In 1853, Johnson was elected governor of Tennessee. He served 2 two-year terms, focusing on education reform and fiscal responsibility. As governor, he continued to champion the interests of small farmers and workers. He also became involved in the growing sectional tensions over slavery. Johnson was a slaveholder himself, owning several enslaved people throughout his life. However, his support for slavery was pragmatic rather than ideological. He defended the institution as it existed in the South but did not advocate for its expansion with the fervor of fire-eating secessionists. After his gubernatorial service, Johnson was elected to the United States Senate in 1857. In the Senate, he found himself caught between the increasingly radical positions on both sides of the slavery question. Johnson remained a Democrat and a defender of Southern rights, but he was also a staunch Unionist who believed in the perpetuity of the federal Union. This position would define the rest of his political career and make him a unique figure in American history. When the secession crisis erupted following Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, Johnson faced the most important decision of his life. Tennessee, like other Southern states, debated whether to leave the Union. Johnson, despite being a Southern Democrat and slaveholder, opposed secession vehemently. He argued that secession was illegal and that it betrayed the Constitution. He gave passionate speeches defending the Union and attacking secessionists as traitors. His position was deeply unpopular in Tennessee and throughout the South. He received death threats and was burned in effigy. His family in Tennessee faced harassment and danger. When Tennessee voted to secede in June 1861, Johnson refused to resign his Senate seat. He was the only Southern senator to remain in Congress after his state seceded. This decision made him a hero in the North and a traitor in the South. Johnson's loyalty to the Union, despite his Southern background and Democratic politics, made him invaluable to the Lincoln administration. He became a symbol of Southern Unionism and proof that not all Southerners supported the rebellion. In March 1862, Lincoln appointed Johnson as military governor of Tennessee. Union forces had captured much of the state, and Lincoln needed someone to restore loyal civil government. Johnson accepted the difficult and dangerous assignment. As military governor, he faced the challenge of governing a state torn by civil war, where Confederate sympathizers remained active and Union control was tenuous. Johnson ruled with an iron hand, arresting suspected Confederate sympathizers, suppressing disloyal newspapers, and requiring loyalty oaths from citizens seeking to do business or practice professions. Johnson's tenure as military governor was controversial. His methods were often harsh and arbitrary. He showed little tolerance for those who had supported secession, even after they claimed to have returned to loyalty. He believed that treason should be punished and that those who had led Tennessee into rebellion should face consequences. At the same time, he worked to organize a loyal state government and to bring Tennessee back into the Union. He encouraged the formation of Union military units from Tennessee residents and supported efforts to abolish slavery in the state. By 1864, as Lincoln prepared for re-election, the president needed to broaden his political appeal. The Republican Party temporarily renamed itself the National Union Party to attract war Democrats and border state Unionists. Lincoln chose Andrew Johnson as his running mate, replacing Vice President Hannibal Hamlin. The selection made political sense. Johnson was a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, exactly the kind of figure who could demonstrate that the war was not a partisan or sectional conflict but a defense of the Constitution. The Lincoln-Johnson ticket won the election of 1864, defeating Democratic candidate George McClellan. Johnson was inaugurated as vice president on March 4, 1865. The inauguration became infamous because Johnson appeared intoxicated during the ceremony. He had been ill with typhoid fever and had taken whiskey as medicine before the event. The alcohol affected him more strongly than he expected, and he gave a rambling, incoherent speech that embarrassed himself and the administration. Lincoln defended Johnson, attributing the incident to illness and exhaustion, but the damage to Johnson's reputation was significant. Johnson served as vice president for only 6 weeks. On April 14, 1865, President Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth at Ford's Theater. Lincoln died the next morning, and Andrew Johnson became President of the United States. He assumed office at one of the most critical moments in American history. The Civil War had just ended with Lee's surrender at Appomattox on April 9. The nation faced the enormous challenge of reconstructing the South and integrating millions of formerly enslaved people into American society as free citizens. Johnson's presidency would be defined by his approach to Reconstruction and his conflict with Congress over how to restore the Southern states to the Union. Johnson believed in a lenient policy toward the defeated Confederacy. He issued a series of proclamations offering amnesty to most former Confederates who would take a loyalty oath. He appointed provisional governors in Southern states and allowed them to organize new governments. His only requirements were that the states ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, repudiate secession, and void Confederate debts. Johnson's Reconstruction policy reflected his political philosophy and his prejudices. He believed in states' rights and limited federal power. He wanted to restore the Southern states to their former position in the Union as quickly as possible with minimal federal interference. He also held deeply racist views about African Americans. He did not believe that black people were equal to white people or that they should have political rights. He opposed efforts to give freed slaves the right to vote or to provide them with federal protection or assistance. Under Johnson's lenient policies, Southern states quickly organized new governments. However, these governments were dominated by former Confederate leaders and passed laws known as Black Codes that severely restricted the rights of freed slaves. The Black Codes varied by state but generally attempted to recreate slavery in all but name, forcing freed people into labor contracts, restricting their movement, and denying them basic civil rights. Violence against freed slaves and white Unionists increased throughout the South. Congress, controlled by Republicans, was outraged by Johnson's policies and the situation in the South. When Congress reconvened in December 1865, Republicans refused to seat representatives and senators from the former Confederate states. They established the Joint Committee on Reconstruction to investigate conditions in the South and develop alternative policies. The stage was set for a confrontation between the President and Congress over who would control Reconstruction policy. In 1866, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which declared that all persons born in the United States were citizens and had certain fundamental rights regardless of race. Johnson vetoed the bill, arguing that it violated states' rights and that Congress should not pass such legislation while the Southern states were unrepresented. Congress overrode his veto, the first time in American history that Congress had overridden a presidential veto on a major piece of legislation. The override demonstrated that Johnson had lost control of Reconstruction policy. Congress followed with the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship to all persons born in the United States and promised equal protection under the law. The amendment was designed to protect the rights of freed slaves and prevent states from denying civil rights based on race. Johnson opposed the amendment and encouraged Southern states to reject it. His opposition further alienated him from congressional Republicans and demonstrated his commitment to white supremacy. In the 1866 midterm elections, Johnson campaigned against congressional Republicans, undertaking a speaking tour known as the Swing Around the Circle. The tour was a disaster. Johnson engaged in undignified arguments with hecklers and gave intemperate speeches attacking his opponents. His behavior shocked many Americans who expected presidential dignity. Republicans won overwhelming victories in the elections, gaining more than a two-thirds majority in both houses of Congress. The election results gave Republicans the power to override any presidential veto and to pursue their own Reconstruction policies without Johnson's cooperation. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Acts over Johnson's vetoes. These acts divided the South into military districts, required new state constitutions guaranteeing black suffrage, and mandated ratification of the 14th Amendment before states could be readmitted to the Union. The acts represented a complete repudiation of Johnson's lenient policies and established congressional control over Reconstruction. Johnson was required to enforce laws he opposed, creating an impossible situation. Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act in 1867, which prohibited the president from removing certain officeholders without Senate approval. The act was designed to protect Republican appointees from being fired by Johnson. The constitutionality of the act was questionable, but Congress passed it over Johnson's veto. The act would become the basis for Johnson's impeachment. Johnson continued to obstruct congressional Reconstruction policies. He interpreted the Reconstruction Acts as narrowly as possible, appointed commanders sympathetic to white Southerners, and used his position to undermine Republican efforts. In August 1867, while Congress was in recess, Johnson suspended Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who had been working with congressional Republicans. Johnson appointed General Ulysses Grant as interim secretary. When the Senate refused to approve Stanton's removal, Grant resigned and Stanton reclaimed his office. Johnson then fired Stanton in February 1868, in direct violation of the Tenure of Office Act. The firing of Stanton provided the pretext congressional Republicans needed. On February 24, 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach President Johnson. The articles of impeachment charged him primarily with violating the Tenure of Office Act, though they also included more general charges of bringing disgrace to the presidency and attempting to undermine congressional authority. Johnson became the first president in American history to be impeached. The Senate trial began in March 1868 and lasted 11 weeks. Johnson did not attend the trial but was represented by capable attorneys who argued that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional and that Johnson had not violated it in any case since Stanton had been appointed by Lincoln, not Johnson. The trial became a national sensation, with packed galleries and extensive press coverage. The outcome would determine not just Johnson's fate but the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches. On May 16 and again on May 26, the Senate voted on the articles of impeachment. The Constitution requires a two-thirds majority to convict. Republicans held 42 seats, exactly the two-thirds needed if all voted to convict. However, 7 Republican senators voted not guilty, believing that the charges did not constitute high crimes and misdemeanors or fearing the precedent of removing a president for political disagreements. The final vote was 35-19, one vote short of the two-thirds needed for conviction. Andrew Johnson remained president, but his power was broken. Johnson served out the remainder of his term as a lame-duck president. He continued to oppose congressional Reconstruction but lacked the power to affect policy. In the 1868 election, Republicans nominated Ulysses Grant for president. Grant won easily, and Johnson left office in March 1869. He did not attend Grant's inauguration, maintaining his bitter opposition to Republican policies to the end. After leaving the presidency, Johnson returned to Tennessee. He remained active in politics, seeking vindication for his presidency. He ran unsuccessfully for Congress in 1869 and for the Senate in 1871. His political career seemed over. However, in 1874, the Tennessee legislature elected him to the United States Senate, making him the only former president to serve in the Senate after leaving the White House. His election was seen as a personal triumph and a measure of vindication. Johnson returned to Washington in March 1875 for a special session of the Senate. He gave a speech attacking the Grant administration's Reconstruction policies and defending his own record. It was his final political statement. On July 31, 1875, while visiting his daughter in Carter County, Tennessee, Andrew Johnson suffered a stroke and died. He was 66 years old. Johnson's funeral was held in Greenville, Tennessee. He was buried wrapped in an American flag with a copy of the Constitution under his head, symbols of the Union he had defended and the document he had claimed to uphold throughout his career. Thousands attended his funeral, reflecting his status as a significant if controversial figure in American history. Johnson's legacy is almost entirely negative. Historians consistently rank him among the worst presidents in American history. His lenient Reconstruction policies allowed the restoration of white supremacy in the South and betrayed the freed slaves who had looked to the federal government for protection. His racism and his opposition to civil rights for African Americans contributed to nearly a century of segregation and discrimination. His obstruction of congressional Reconstruction created a constitutional crisis that nearly destroyed the presidency. Modern historians recognize that Johnson faced an extraordinarily difficult situation. He assumed office at a moment of national crisis with no electoral mandate and no political base. He was a Democrat governing with a Republican Congress. He was a Southerner trying to restore the South while maintaining Northern support. However, these circumstances do not excuse his failures. Johnson's rigid adherence to states' rights and white supremacy, his inability to compromise, and his personal animosity toward his opponents made a bad situation worse. Perhaps the most damning verdict on Johnson's presidency is what happened in the South after his policies failed. The brief period of Reconstruction that followed congressional action saw African Americans voting, holding office, and exercising their rights as citizens. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, white Southerners systematically stripped black citizens of these rights through violence, intimidation, and discriminatory laws. The Jim Crow system that emerged would last until the 1960s. Johnson's opposition to protecting the rights of freed slaves contributed directly to this tragic outcome. Johnson represents a particular type of political leader, the principled man whose principles are fundamentally wrong. He genuinely believed in his interpretation of the Constitution and in limited federal power. He sincerely thought that his policies were correct. However, his principles were rooted in racism and a political philosophy that could not address the reality of post-Civil War America. His tragedy was not that he betrayed his beliefs, but that his beliefs led him to betray the promise of freedom that the Civil War had created. In the end, Andrew Johnson was a self-made man who rose from poverty to the presidency through determination and political skill, only to fail catastrophically when given the opportunity to shape the nation's future. His legacy includes the first presidential impeachment and a Reconstruction policy that abandoned millions of freed slaves to violence and oppression. He is remembered today primarily for his failures, which is perhaps fitting for a president whose actions had such devastating consequences for so many Americans. Johnson died believing he had defended the Constitution and the rights of states, but history has judged that he defended only the right of white Southerners to oppress Black Americans. Rutherford Beachard Hayes was an Ohio gentleman and a complex political figure who became one of the most controversial presidents in American history. Rutherford Beachard Hayes, Union General and later President, was born in Delaware, Ohio on October 4, 1822. He came from a modest family. His father, also named Rutherford Hayes, died 10 weeks before his birth, leaving his mother Sophia Beachard Hayes to raise him and his sister Fanny. He had a studious appearance with his full beard. Hayes's early years were marked by ambition and determination, shaped significantly by his uncle Sardis Beachard, who became a father figure and benefactor to the fatherless boy. Hayes attended local schools in Delaware and showed early academic promise. His uncle Sardis recognized the boy's potential and provided financial support for his education. In 1838, Hayes enrolled at Kenyon College in Gambia, Ohio. He excelled in his studies, graduating as valedictorian of his class in 1842. His education there shaped his understanding of law, politics, and civic duty, though his later career would test those lessons in ways he could never have imagined during his college years. After graduating from Kenyon College, Hayes decided to pursue a legal career. He enrolled at Harvard Law School, one of the most prestigious legal institutions in the country. He graduated in 1845 and was admitted to the Ohio bar. Hayes began his legal practice in Lower Sandusky, Ohio, now known as Fremont, where his uncle Sardis lived. However, the small town offered limited opportunities for an ambitious young lawyer. In 1849, Hayes moved to Cincinnati, Ohio's largest city, where he believed he could build a more substantial legal practice. In Cincinnati, Hayes established himself as a capable attorney. He took on a variety of cases, including criminal defense work. His practice grew steadily, and he developed a reputation as a thorough and ethical lawyer. Hayes was particularly known for his willingness to defend unpopular clients and causes. He defended several fugitive slaves in cases brought under the Fugitive Slave Act, work that reflected his growing opposition to slavery. These cases were controversial and sometimes dangerous, but Hayes believed in the principle that everyone deserved legal representation. During his Cincinnati years, Hayes also became involved in local politics and social causes. He joined the Literary Club, a discussion group that brought together the city's intellectual elite. He became active in the Sons of Temperance, reflecting his belief in moral reform. He also developed connections with the emerging Republican Party, which opposed the expansion of slavery into the Western territories. These associations would shape his political future. In 1852, Hayes married Lucy Ware Webb, a graduate of Cincinnati's Wesleyan Female College. Lucy was an intelligent and principled woman who shared Hayes's opposition to slavery. She was deeply religious and would become known for her strong moral convictions. The marriage was happy and produced 8 children, though 3 died in infancy. Lucy would be an important influence on Hayes throughout his life, and her views on temperance and social reform would later influence his presidency. By the late 1850s, Hayes had become increasingly involved in Republican Party politics. He was appointed Cincinnati City Solicitor in 1858, his first public office. The position involved representing the city in legal matters and provided Hayes with valuable experience in public administration. He served competently in this role, enhancing his reputation as a capable public servant. However, his tenure as city solicitor was interrupted by the outbreak of the Civil War in April 1861. When the Civil War began, Hayes was nearly 39 years old, married with children, and established in his legal career. He had every reason to remain at home. However, he felt a strong sense of duty to defend the Union. He wrote in his diary that he would prefer to die in the war than to live through it without having served. In June 1861, Hayes was commissioned as a major in the 23rd Ohio Volunteer Infantry. His regiment was assigned to Western Virginia, where Union forces were working to secure the region and prevent it from joining the Confederacy. Hayes proved to be a capable and courageous officer. He took his military responsibilities seriously, studying tactics and caring for his men. His legal training served him well in the administrative aspects of command. In September 1861, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel. His regiment participated in several small engagements in Western Virginia, learning the realities of warfare through these early experiences. Hayes demonstrated both bravery and competence, earning the respect of his soldiers. The 23rd Ohio Infantry included several men who would later achieve prominence. William McKinley, who would become president in 1897, served as a commissary sergeant in the regiment. Hayes took note of the young McKinley and would later support his political career. The regiment also included future congressman and diplomat Stanley Matthews. These connections would prove valuable in Hayes's post-war political career. In September 1862, Hayes participated in the Battle of South Mountain in Maryland. During the fighting, he was severely wounded when a musket ball struck his left arm above the elbow, fracturing the bone. Rather than leaving the field, Hayes had his arm bandaged and continued to lead his men until the battle ended. His courage under fire earned him widespread praise and promotion to colonel. The wound took months to heal and left his arm permanently weakened, but Hayes recovered sufficiently to return to duty. Following his recovery, Hayes and his regiment participated in several campaigns in West Virginia and the Shenandoah Valley. In 1864, he was given command of the 1st Brigade of the Kanawha Division. His brigade fought in the Valley campaigns of 1864 under General Philip Sheridan. These were brutal operations designed to destroy the agricultural resources of the Shenandoah Valley and eliminate it as a source of supplies for the Confederate Army. Hayes's brigade participated in the battles of Opequon, Fisher's Hill, and Cedar Creek. At Cedar Creek in October 1864, Hayes had his horse shot from under him but escaped injury. His performance in these battles earned him promotion to brigadier general in October 1864. Hayes's military service was distinguished by steady competence rather than brilliance. He was not a great tactical innovator, but he was brave, reliable, and cared for his men. His soldiers respected him, and his superiors trusted him. He was wounded 5 times during the war, had 4 horses shot from under him, and earned a reputation as one of the most combat-tested officers in the Union Army. By the time the war ended, he had been promoted to brevet major general, a recognition of his faithful service. While Hayes was still in the field in 1864, Ohio Republicans nominated him for Congress. Hayes refused to campaign, stating that any officer who would abandon his post to campaign for Congress ought to be scalped. This principled stance enhanced his reputation and he won election easily. However, he did not take his seat until after the war ended. He resigned his commission in June 1865 and finally joined Congress in December of that year. Hayes served 2 terms in the House of Representatives from 1865 to 1867. He was a loyal Republican who supported the radical Republican program of Reconstruction. He voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law to former slaves. He supported military reconstruction of the South and voting rights for freedmen. His voting record reflected his belief that the Union victory should result in fundamental changes in American society, particularly regarding the rights of African Americans. However, Hayes was not entirely comfortable in Congress. He found the legislative process frustrating and the partisan atmosphere of Washington distasteful. He preferred executive roles where he could implement policy rather than debate it. When Ohio Republicans approached him about running for governor in 1867, he welcomed the opportunity. He resigned from Congress and successfully ran for governor, winning by a narrow margin. Hayes served as governor of Ohio from 1868 to 1872, and then again from 1876 to 1877. His first 2 terms were marked by moderate, reform-oriented policies. He worked to establish a state geological survey, reform the state prison system, and improve treatment of the mentally ill. He supported the ratification of the 15th Amendment, which prohibited denial of voting rights based on race. He advocated for merit-based civil service reform, arguing that government positions should be awarded based on competence rather than political loyalty. These positions established Hayes as a reform-minded Republican. After declining to run for a 3rd consecutive term in 1872, Hayes temporarily retired from politics. He spent 3 years focusing on his family and business interests. However, the Ohio Republican Party persuaded him to run for governor again in 1875. The campaign was seen as a test of Republican strength nationally, as the party had been damaged by corruption scandals during the Grant administration. Hayes ran on a platform of honest government and sound money, opposing the inflationary policies advocated by Democrats. He won a narrow victory that attracted national attention. Hayes's victory in Ohio made him a potential presidential candidate for 1876. The Republican Party needed a candidate who could distance the party from the corruption of the Grant years while maintaining party unity. Hayes fit this profile perfectly. He had a distinguished war record, a reputation for honesty, and moderate views that could appeal to reformers without alienating party regulars. At the Republican National Convention in Cincinnati in June 1876, Hayes emerged as a compromise candidate and won the nomination on the 7th ballot. The 1876 presidential election became one of the most controversial in American history. Hayes faced Democrat Samuel Tilden, the reform governor of New York. The campaign focused on corruption, economic policy, and Reconstruction. Tilden won the popular vote by a margin of about 250,000 votes out of more than 8 million cast. However, the electoral vote was disputed. Returns from South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and Oregon were contested, with both parties claiming victory in those states. The Constitution provided no clear mechanism for resolving disputed electoral votes. The country faced a genuine constitutional crisis. Some Democrats threatened armed resistance if Tilden was denied the presidency. Congress eventually created a special electoral commission composed of senators, representatives, and Supreme Court justices to resolve the disputes. The commission, which had a Republican majority, voted along party lines to award all disputed electoral votes to Hayes, giving him a 185 to 184 electoral vote victory. The decision was accepted only after secret negotiations between Hayes's representatives and Southern Democrats. In what became known as the Compromise of 1877, Hayes's supporters agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South, effectively ending Reconstruction, in exchange for Democratic acceptance of Hayes's election. Hayes also agreed to appoint a Southerner to his cabinet and support federal funding for internal improvements in the South. This compromise allowed Hayes to take office but forever tainted his presidency with questions about its legitimacy. Hayes was inaugurated on March 5, 1877, after taking the oath of office privately on March 3 because Inauguration Day fell on a Sunday. He entered office under a cloud of controversy, with many Democrats referring to him as Rutherford Hayes or his fraudulency. The circumstances of his election would shadow his entire presidency and limit his political effectiveness. True to the Compromise of 1877, Hayes withdrew federal troops from South Carolina and Louisiana in April 1877, ending the last Republican state governments in the South. This decision effectively ended Reconstruction and allowed white Democrats to regain control of Southern state governments. The withdrawal was controversial among Republicans, particularly African Americans and their white allies who saw it as a betrayal of the principles for which the Civil War had been fought. Hayes believed that military occupation was no longer sustainable and that reconciliation with the white South was necessary for national healing. However, the consequences for Southern blacks were severe, as the end of federal protection led to the systematic disenfranchisement and oppression that would last for generations. Despite the controversial beginning, Hayes pursued a reform agenda as president. He was committed to civil service reform and opposed the spoils system that had led to corruption in the Grant administration. He issued an executive order prohibiting federal employees from participating in political campaigns or being required to make political contributions. He fought with Senator Roscoe Conkling of New York, the leader of the Republican Party's stalwart faction, over patronage appointments. When Conkling's allies in the New York Custom House refused to implement Hayes's reforms, Hayes removed them from office, including future President Chester Arthur. This battle established Hayes's independence but made him enemies within his own party. Hayes also faced significant labor unrest during his presidency. In July 1877, just months after taking office, the Great Railroad Strike erupted when railroad companies cut wages. The strike spread across the country, paralyzing rail traffic and leading to violent confrontations between strikers and state militia. Hayes deployed federal troops to restore order, the first use of federal troops to break a strike. His action was controversial, criticized by labor advocates as favoring corporations over workers. Hayes believed he had a constitutional duty to ensure that interstate commerce could function, but the incident highlighted the growing tensions between labor and capital in industrializing America. On monetary policy, Hayes supported the gold standard and opposed inflation. He vetoed the Bland-Allison Act, which would have required the government to purchase and coin silver, potentially inflating the currency. Congress overrode his veto, but Hayes had established his position in favor of sound money. This stance pleased Eastern financial interests but angered farmers and debtors who favored inflation to ease their debt burdens. Hayes's presidency also dealt with Native American policy. He appointed Carl Schurz, a reform-minded German immigrant, as Secretary of the Interior. Schurz attempted to reform the corrupt Indian Bureau and improve conditions on reservations. However, the fundamental policy remained one of forced assimilation and confinement to reservations. Hayes supported efforts to civilize Native Americans through education and Christianity, reflecting the paternalistic attitudes of the era. The Nez Perce War of 1877 occurred during his presidency, ending with Chief Joseph's famous surrender speech. In foreign policy, Hayes's presidency was relatively quiet. He dealt with disputes over fishing rights with Canada and worked to improve relations with Mexico. He also took interest in a potential canal across Central America, declaring in a message to Congress that any such canal would be under American control, foreshadowing the later Panama Canal policy. His foreign policy was generally cautious and avoided major conflicts. Lucy Hayes, the First Lady, brought her strong moral convictions to the White House. She banned alcohol from White House functions, earning the nickname Lemonade Lucy. This policy reflected both her personal beliefs and Hayes's political calculation that supporting temperance would appeal to an important reform constituency. The alcohol ban was mocked by some but praised by temperance advocates. Lucy Hayes was also the First Lady to have graduated from college, and she took an active interest in social causes, particularly veterans' welfare. Hayes had announced before taking office that he would serve only one term. This decision was partly strategic, intended to position himself as above politics, but it also reflected his genuine distaste for the partisan battles of Washington. As his term progressed, he became increasingly frustrated with congressional opposition and intra-party feuding. He looked forward to retirement and the opportunity to focus on causes he cared about without the constraints of political office. When Hayes left office in March 1881, he retired to his estate, Spiegel Grove, in Fremont, Ohio. His post-presidential years were active and fulfilling. He devoted himself to philanthropic and educational causes. He became a trustee of Ohio State University and worked to promote education, particularly for African Americans in the South. He served as president of the Peabody Education Fund, which supported black education in the South. He also worked with the Slater Fund, another organization devoted to African American education. These activities reflected his continued belief in the importance of education for former slaves, even as his withdrawal of federal troops had facilitated their political oppression. Hayes also remained active in veterans affairs. He served as president of the National Prison Reform Association, advocating for humane treatment of prisoners and rehabilitation rather than purely punitive approaches to criminal justice. He spoke frequently on topics of reform, education, and national unity. His post-presidential years were marked by a consistency of principle and genuine commitment to public service that had characterized his entire career. Hayes's personal life in retirement was marked by both contentment and tragedy. He and Lucy enjoyed their time at Spiegel Grove, surrounded by family and engaged in meaningful work. However, in June 1889, Lucy died suddenly of a stroke. Hayes was devastated by the loss of his partner of 37 years. He wrote that his life had been so happy, so successful, so undisturbed with her, and her death left him bereft. He continued his public activities but never fully recovered from her loss. On January 14, 1893, while traveling by train to Cleveland, Hayes suffered a heart attack. He was brought back to Spiegel Grove, where he died 3 days later on January 17, 1893. He was 70 years old. His last words reportedly were, "I know that I'm going where Lucy is." Hayes was buried next to Lucy at Spiegel Grove. His funeral was attended by thousands, including President-elect Grover Cleveland, reflecting the respect Hayes had earned in his post-presidential years. Hayes's legacy is complex and controversial. His presidency was constrained by the circumstances of his election and his one-term pledge. He accomplished less than he hoped in civil service reform, though he established principles that would guide later reformers. His withdrawal of troops from the South ended Reconstruction and abandoned African Americans to decades of oppression, though he continued to support black education in his retirement. He was honest and principled in an era of corruption, but his presidency lacked the political skill to translate principles into lasting achievements. Modern historians have offered mixed assessments of Hayes. Some credit him with restoring integrity to the presidency after the Grant scandals and with beginning the process of civil service reform. Others condemn him for ending Reconstruction and betraying African Americans. Most acknowledge that he faced extraordinarily difficult circumstances and conducted himself with personal honor, even if his policy choices were questionable. His presidency marked a transition from the issues of the Civil War and Reconstruction to the issues of industrialization and reform that would dominate the late 19th century. Hayes represents a particular type of political leader, the principled moderate who seeks to balance competing interests and promote gradual reform. He was neither a radical nor a reactionary, but rather a cautious reformer who believed in working within existing institutions. His tragedy was that the circumstances of his election and the political constraints of his time prevented him from achieving more substantial reforms. His decision to end Reconstruction, while perhaps politically necessary, had devastating consequences that he did not fully anticipate or address. In the end, Rutherford Hayes was neither a great president nor a failed one, but rather a decent man who did his best in extraordinarily difficult circumstances. His legacy includes both his efforts at reform and his abandonment of Reconstruction. He is remembered today primarily for the disputed election of 1876 and for ending Reconstruction, which is perhaps incomplete for a man who served his country faithfully in war and peace and devoted his retirement to education and reform. Hayes was, even in death, a man of contradictions, remembered for political controversy rather than for his genuine integrity and his commitment to public service. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois was a towering intellectual figure and one of the most influential African American leaders of the 20th century. W.E.B. Du Bois, scholar, activist, and writer, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts on February 23, 1868. He came from a mixed racial background. He had a commanding presence and piercing intellect. Du Bois's early years were marked by academic excellence and growing awareness of racial inequality. He attended local schools where he was often the only black student, graduating as valedictorian of his high school class in 1884. His education there shaped his understanding of race and society, though his later career would test those lessons in the most profound ways imaginable. After high school, Du Bois attended Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, his first extended experience in the segregated South. The contrast between his relatively integrated upbringing in Massachusetts and the harsh realities of Jim Crow Tennessee was shocking. He witnessed systematic discrimination, violence against African Americans, and the suffocating restrictions of segregation. It was during this time that Du Bois began developing his ideas about race, equality, and the struggle for civil rights. In 1888, Du Bois graduated from Fisk and enrolled at Harvard University to pursue further studies. He had earned a scholarship based on his exceptional academic record. He studied history and philosophy at Harvard, immersing himself in the works of great thinkers and developing his analytical skills. The university was prestigious but also isolating for one of the few black students. Du Bois experienced both the opportunities of elite education and the sting of social exclusion. Du Bois's academic career showed remarkable promise. He graduated from Harvard with a bachelor's degree in 1890, then completed a master's degree in 1891. His thesis focused on the suppression of the African slave trade, demonstrating his early interest in the historical foundations of racial oppression. However, despite his accomplishments, Du Bois struggled with the limitations placed on African Americans even in academic circles. He was brilliant but constrained by the racial prejudices of his era. After completing his master's degree, Du Bois received a fellowship to study at the University of Berlin in Germany from 1892 to 1894. This period was transformative. In Europe, he experienced a level of social freedom unavailable to black Americans at home. He studied with prominent scholars, traveled extensively, and developed a broader perspective on race and colonialism. The experience reinforced his belief that racial prejudice was not natural or inevitable but rather a social construct that could be challenged and changed. Du Bois returned to the United States in 1894 and began teaching classics at Wilberforce University in Ohio. He also continued his doctoral studies at Harvard, working on a dissertation about the suppression of the African slave trade to America. In 1895, he became the first African American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. The achievement was groundbreaking, a testament to his intellectual abilities and determination. His dissertation was later published and remains an important historical work. The completion of his doctorate marked Du Bois as one of the most educated African Americans of his generation. In 1896, Du Bois accepted a position at the University of Pennsylvania to conduct a sociological study of Philadelphia's black community. The resulting work, published in 1899 as The Philadelphia Negro, was a pioneering piece of American sociology. Du Bois conducted extensive interviews, gathered statistical data, and analyzed the social and economic conditions of African Americans in the city. The study was groundbreaking in its methodology and conclusions. It demonstrated that poverty and social problems in black communities were the result of discrimination and limited opportunities rather than any inherent deficiencies in African Americans themselves. The work established Du Bois as a serious scholar and social scientist. Following his work in Philadelphia, Du Bois joined the faculty of Atlanta University in 1897, where he would remain for 13 years. At Atlanta, he organized annual conferences on African American life and published numerous sociological studies. He was building a body of scholarly work that documented the conditions of black Americans and challenged racist assumptions. His research was meticulous and his conclusions were powerful. He believed that rigorous scholarship could combat prejudice and promote social change. In 1903, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk, a collection of essays that would become his most famous and influential work. The book was a profound meditation on the African American experience. In it, Du Bois introduced several concepts that would shape discussions of race for generations. He described the double consciousness of African Americans, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of a racist society, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. He articulated the psychological burden of living in a society that simultaneously denied one's humanity and demanded one's labor. The Souls of Black Folk also contained Du Bois's famous critique of Booker T. Washington, the most prominent African American leader of the era. Washington advocated accommodation with segregation, urging African Americans to focus on economic advancement through industrial education rather than demanding political and social equality. Du Bois disagreed fundamentally with this approach. He argued that African Americans should demand full civil rights immediately and that higher education, not just vocational training, was essential for developing leaders who could guide the race forward. The debate between Du Bois and Washington defined African American political thought in the early 20th century. Du Bois believed in the concept of the talented tenth, the idea that a college-educated elite would lead the masses of African Americans to social and economic progress. This was an elitist notion, but Du Bois saw it as practical. He argued that every group needed educated leaders and that denying higher education to African Americans would perpetuate their subordinate status. The talented 10th would be the teachers, doctors, lawyers, and ministers who would serve their communities and fight for racial justice. In 1905, Du Bois helped organize the Niagara Movement, a group of African American intellectuals and activists who demanded full civil rights, an end to racial discrimination, and recognition of human brotherhood. The movement was named for its first meeting near Niagara Falls. It was a direct challenge to Booker T. Washington's accommodationist philosophy. The Niagara Movement was small and struggled with limited resources, but it laid the groundwork for more effective civil rights organizations. The group issued powerful declarations demanding equality and justice, establishing a more militant tradition of civil rights activism. The Niagara Movement eventually evolved into the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, founded in 1909. Du Bois was the only African American among the organization's original leadership, which included white progressives and social reformers. He became the director of publications and research, a position that gave him a platform to reach a national audience. In 1910, Du Bois founded and began editing The Crisis, the NAACP's monthly magazine. It would become the most important African American publication of its era. The Crisis was Du Bois's greatest platform for his ideas. Through its pages, he reported on racial violence, discrimination, and civil rights struggles. He published poetry, fiction, and art by African Americans, promoting Black cultural achievement. He wrote editorials that were passionate, eloquent, and uncompromising in their demand for equality. The magazine's circulation grew rapidly, reaching 100,000 by 1920. Du Bois used the crisis to shape public opinion, mobilize activism, and build a sense of collective identity among African Americans. During World War I, Du Bois faced a difficult dilemma. He initially supported the war effort, controversially urging African Americans to close ranks and support the nation despite continued discrimination. He hoped that loyal service would earn African Americans greater respect and rights. However, the war years saw continued racial violence, including deadly riots in East St. Louis in 1917. After the war, returning Black soldiers faced intensified racism rather than gratitude for their service. The Red Summer of 1919 saw racial violence erupt in cities across America. Du Bois's hopes for progress through patriotic service proved naive. The post-war years radicalized Du Bois further. He became increasingly interested in Pan-Africanism, the movement to unite people of African descent worldwide in the struggle against colonialism and racism. He organized a series of Pan-African congresses, bringing together activists and intellectuals from Africa, the Caribbean, and the United States. These conferences had limited immediate impact but helped build international networks of resistance to colonialism. Du Bois saw the struggles of African Americans as connected to the struggles of colonized peoples everywhere. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Du Bois continued his work with the NAACP and the Crisis. However, tensions grew between Du Bois and the organization's leadership. Du Bois was becoming more radical in his economic views, increasingly sympathetic to socialism. He criticized the NAACP's focus on legal challenges and its alliance with white liberals. He argued for more economic self-sufficiency and self-determination for African Americans. In 1934, these tensions came to a head when Du Bois published editorials suggesting that African Americans should embrace voluntary self-segregation to build economic strength. The NAACP leadership, committed to integration, was appalled. Du Bois resigned from the organization. After leaving the NAACP, Du Bois returned to Atlanta University where he established a sociology program and continued his research and writing. He published Black Reconstruction in America in 1935, a massive revisionist history of the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. The book challenged the prevailing racist interpretation of Reconstruction, which portrayed it as a disaster caused by corrupt Black politicians and their white allies. Du Bois argued that Reconstruction was a noble experiment in interracial democracy that was destroyed by violent white supremacist resistance. The book was largely ignored by mainstream historians at the time but later recognized as a groundbreaking work. During the late 1930s and 1940s, Du Bois became increasingly interested in Marxism and socialism. He saw capitalism as inherently connected to racism and imperialism. He believed that economic exploitation and racial oppression were intertwined and that neither could be eliminated without addressing both. This ideological evolution put him at odds with mainstream civil rights organizations and made him suspect in an increasingly anti-communist America. His radical views would eventually cost him dearly. In 1944, Du Bois returned to the NAACP as Director of Special Research. However, his second tenure with the organization was troubled from the start. His radical politics clashed with the NAACP's more moderate approach. He advocated for closer ties with the Soviet Union and criticized American foreign policy. He attended international peace conferences and spoke out against colonialism and nuclear weapons. In 1948, he was again forced out of the NAACP, this time permanently. It was a bitter end to his relationship with the organization he had helped create. The 1950s were difficult years for Du Bois. The Cold War was at its height and his leftist politics made him a target. In 1951, he was indicted as an unregistered agent of a foreign power because of his work with the Peace Information Center, an organization advocating for nuclear disarmament. The charges were eventually dismissed, but the trial was humiliating and financially devastating. Du Bois was fingerprinted and placed in handcuffs like a common criminal. The State Department revoked his passport, preventing him from traveling abroad for 8 years. He was blacklisted, marginalized, and treated as a pariah by many who had once respected him. Despite these difficulties, Du Bois continued writing and speaking. He completed a trilogy of historical novels about African American history. He wrote his autobiography. He remained intellectually active and politically committed even as he was ostracized by mainstream society. In 1961, at the age of 93, Du Bois joined the Communist Party USA. It was a defiant gesture, a rejection of the American system that had rejected him. Shortly afterward, he accepted an invitation from Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, to move to that newly independent African nation and work on an Encyclopedia Africana project. Du Bois and his wife Shirley Graham Du Bois moved to Accra, Ghana in 1961. He had married Shirley Graham in 1951, after the death of his first wife Nina. In Ghana, Du Bois was treated as an honored elder statesman. He became a Ghanaian citizen in 1963, renouncing his American citizenship in frustration with his homeland's continued racism and political persecution. He worked on the Encyclopedia Africana, attempting to create a comprehensive reference work on African and African diaspora history and culture. It was an ambitious project that he would not live to complete. On August 27, 1963, W.E.B. Du Bois died in Accra, Ghana at the age of 95. He died on the eve of the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King Jr. would deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Roy Wilkins, leader of the NAACP, announced Du Bois's death to the assembled crowd, asking for a moment of silence. It was a poignant moment, the passing of an elder generation of civil rights leaders as a new phase of the movement reached its crescendo. Du Bois was buried in Accra with state honors. Du Bois's legacy is immense and complex. He was a pioneering scholar who helped establish sociology as a discipline and produced groundbreaking work on race and society. He was a brilliant writer whose essays and books remain powerful and relevant. He was a civil rights leader who fought tirelessly for equality and justice. He was an internationalist who connected the African American struggle to global movements against colonialism and oppression. He lived for 95 years, spanning from the era of Reconstruction to the height of the civil rights movement, and his work influenced generations of activists and intellectuals. Yet Du Bois's legacy also includes contradictions and controversies. His elitism sometimes blinded him to the experiences and wisdom of ordinary African Americans. His ideological rigidity could make him difficult to work with. His embrace of communism and the Soviet Union, while understandable given his disillusionment with American racism, led him to downplay the authoritarian nature of communist regimes. His later years were marked by bitterness and isolation from the mainstream civil rights movement he had helped create. Modern scholars recognize Du Bois as one of the most important intellectuals of the 20th century. His concept of double consciousness remains central to understanding the African American experience. His critique of Booker T. Washington established a tradition of militant civil rights activism. His sociological work pioneered the use of empirical research to combat racism. His historical writing, particularly Black Reconstruction, transformed understanding of American history. His Pan-Africanism helped inspire independence movements across Africa. Perhaps Du Bois's greatest contribution was his unwavering insistence on the full humanity and equality of African Americans. At a time when scientific racism was mainstream and segregation was the law of the land, Du Bois demanded recognition of Black intelligence, culture, and achievement. He refused to accept any compromise with white supremacy. He insisted that African Americans deserved not just economic opportunity but also political power, social equality, and cultural respect. This uncompromising stance, while it sometimes isolated him, established a standard that inspired subsequent generations. Du Bois represents a particular type of intellectual leader, the scholar-activist who combines rigorous research with passionate advocacy. He believed that knowledge was a tool for social change, that understanding oppression was the first step toward ending it. His life's work was dedicated to documenting the realities of racism and articulating a vision of a more just society. He was willing to sacrifice personal comfort and professional advancement for his principles. In the end, W.E.B. Du Bois was neither a saint nor a simple hero, but rather a complex figure who dedicated his extraordinary talents to the struggle for racial justice. His legacy includes both brilliant scholarship and political missteps, both inspiring activism and troubling ideological commitments. He is remembered today as one of the founding fathers of the civil rights movement, a pioneering sociologist, and one of the greatest African American intellectuals. His writings remain essential reading for anyone seeking to understand race in America. Du Bois was in death as in life a figure of profound significance, remembered for his intellectual brilliance and his unwavering commitment to equality and justice.